Joshua, the story of faith, one book at a time. Joshua is the book where promise begins to become possession. That does not mean the whole story is finished. It does not mean every promise God made to Abraham has reached its final fulfillment. And it does not mean Israel has arrived at the deepest rest God intends for his people. But Joshua is still a major turning point in the story of faith. God had called Abraham and promised him land, offspring, and blessing. Abraham lived as a sojourner. Isaac and Jacob lived as heirs of the same promise, but they did not possess the land as a nation. Joseph died in Egypt, trusting that God would one day bring his people back. Then came slavery. Then came Exodus. Then came Sinai. Then came wilderness wandering, judgment, mercy, and covenant renewal. And now in Joshua, the people stand at the edge of the land. This is the story of faith, one book at a time. And today, we are walking through the book of Joshua. Joshua matters because it shows us that God keeps his promises, but his promises call his people to faithful response. The old generation had seen God's works and still turned back in fear. The new generation faces rivers, walls, kings, armies, and unfinished battles. But this generation is called to walk forward because God has spoken. So we need to be careful how we read this book. Joshua is not mainly a leadership manual. It is not mainly a book about human courage, and it is not a celebration of Israel's military strength. Joshua is about the faithful God who brings his people into the inheritance he promised, fights for them, judges evil, shows mercy, and calls his people to live with loyal trust under his word. Joshua reminds us that faith is not bare agreement with God's promises. Faith crosses the river. Faith follows God's presence. Faith obeys when the command seems strange. Faith trembles when sin has broken fellowship. Faith remembers what God has done. And faith receives the gift without treating the gift as though it belongs apart from the giver. So before we walk through the book, let's get our bearings. Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible. It follows the 5 books of the Torah and begins the section of the Old Testament that tells the story of Israel in the land. The book is named after Joshua, the son of Nun. Joshua had served as Moses' assistant, and now he leads Israel after Moses' death. Joshua is not presented as another Moses in every respect, but the book makes clear that the Lord is with Joshua as he had been with Moses, and that matters from the opening scene. Moses is dead. Israel is near the Jordan River, and the land God promised to Abraham's offspring is just ahead. The wilderness generation has died. Moses has renewed the covenant with the next generation in Deuteronomy. Now the question is whether this generation will move forward in faith where the previous generation turned back in fear. Joshua is mainly historical narrative, but it also includes speeches, covenant renewal, land allotments, memorials, and records of inheritance. Its key figures include Joshua, Rahab, Achan, Caleb, the Gibeonites, Eleazar the priest, the tribal leaders, and the people of Israel. The book covers Israel's entrance into Canaan, the crossing of the Jordan, the fall of Jericho, the defeat and restoration after Ai, the deception of the Gibeonites, the major campaigns in the land, the distribution of tribal inheritances, and Joshua's final covenant addresses. So the book has a clear movement. Israel moves from wilderness to land, promise moves toward possession. The ark moves before the people. The tribes move into their inheritance, and at the end of the book, Joshua presses the people to decide whether they will keep serving the Lord who brought them there. Now let's place Joshua inside the larger story. Genesis gave the promise. Exodus showed God rescuing Abraham's descendants from slavery. Leviticus taught how a holy God could dwell among his covenant people. Numbers showed the danger of unbelief in the wilderness. Deuteronomy renewed the covenant with the generation about to enter the land. And Joshua shows God beginning to give what he promised. That is important because the land promise was not new. God had spoken it centuries earlier. Abraham did not receive it in his lifetime. Isaac did not receive it in his lifetime. Jacob did not receive it in his lifetime. Joseph died in Egypt, still looking forward to the day when God would bring his people back. But God's delay did not mean God had forgotten. Joshua teaches us that time does not weaken the promises of God. What seems impossibly long to us is not fragile in his hands. God moves according to his own wisdom, patience, justice, and purpose. And that matters for us too, because we also live between promise and fulfillment. Jesus has promised to return. Many generations have passed since that promise was given, but the passing of time does not lessen the certainty of his word. God's timeline is not ours, but his promises do not expire. Joshua also prepares us for the next book, Judges. That contrast matters. Joshua is not a story of perfect obedience. There is sin, there is failure, there are poor decisions, but the overall movement is one of covenant responsiveness. Israel crosses, Israel obeys, Israel remembers, Israel confronts sin, Israel receives inheritance, Israel renews allegiance. In Joshua, imperfect people move forward under God's word. In Judges, imperfect people begin doing what is right in their own eyes. With that larger setting in mind, let's walk through the book itself. Joshua begins with Moses dead and Israel facing the Jordan. That opening matters. The people are not being asked to follow Moses again. They are being called to trust the same Lord who had been with Moses. God commissions Joshua and tells him to be strong and courageous. But that courage is not rooted in Joshua's personality. It is rooted in God's presence and God's word. The Lord tells Joshua that he will be with him wherever he goes. Joshua is also commanded to meditate on the book of the law and obey it carefully. That means the courage Joshua needs is not self-confidence. It is confidence shaped by the word and presence of God. Before Israel enters the land, Joshua sends spies into Jericho. And there we meet Rahab. Rahab has heard what the Lord did in Egypt and beyond the Jordan. She knows that the Lord has given the land to Israel, and she asks for mercy. Her story is important because Joshua does not present the conquest as simple ethnic hatred. Rahab is a Canaanite. She is in Jericho, but she turns toward the Lord and aligns herself with his people, and she is spared. Before the walls of Jericho fall, mercy has already appeared. Then in Joshua chapters 3 and 4, Israel crosses the Jordan. The Ark of the Covenant goes before them, and the waters are cut off so the people can pass through on dry ground. This crossing reminds us of the Red Sea. In Exodus, God brought his people out of bondage through the waters. In Joshua, God brings his people into the land through the waters. The people are not leading themselves into the promise. The presence of the Lord goes before them. After the crossing, Israel sets up memorial stones so future generations will ask what they mean. That is not a small detail. Joshua is deeply concerned with memory. God's people must not only experience deliverance, they must remember it. They must tell it. They must teach it to their children. Faithfulness weakens when memory fades, so the stones stand as witnesses. The next generation must know that the Lord dried up the Jordan and brought his people into the land. Before the conquest advances, Israel is circumcised and the people keep the Passover. That also matters. Israel does not enter the land merely as an army. They enter as the covenant people of the Lord. Their identity is not built on military power. Their identity is built on the God who rescued them, claimed them, and brought them into his promise. Then comes Jericho. Jericho falls in Joshua chapter 6, but not because Israel has superior siege tactics. The walls fall because the Lord gives the city into their hand. The people march, the priests blow the trumpets, the people shout, and the wall falls. Jericho teaches Israel from the beginning that the land will not be received by human strength alone. The Lord fights for his people. But Joshua chapter 7 brings a severe warning. Achan takes some of the devoted things from Jericho and hides them among his belongings. Joshua chapter 7 verse 1 says that the people of Israel broke faith. That language matters. Achan's sin is not merely a private mistake. It is covenant treachery. He takes what belongs to the Lord and treats it as though it belongs to him. Then Israel is defeated at Ai. From a normal military perspective, the death of about 36 men may not sound like a crushing loss. But in Joshua, it shakes the people because when the Lord fights for Israel, his protection lacks nothing. The defeat at Ai reveals that something is wrong between Israel and the Lord. Victory was never rooted in Israel's strength. It was rooted in God's presence, power, and covenant favor. After the sin is exposed and judged, Ai is taken. The lesson is sobering. God's people cannot carry hidden disobedience into the promise and presume upon God's presence. Joshua chapter 8 brings the covenant word back to the center. Joshua builds an altar, reads the law, and places blessing and curse before the people. The conquest is not separated from covenant. The people who receive the land must live under the word of the Lord. Then, in Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites deceive Israel by pretending to come from a distant land. Joshua and the leaders make a covenant with them, but the text tells us the problem plainly. They did not ask counsel from the Lord. That episode matters because even faithful leaders can make poor decisions when they act by sight instead of seeking God's counsel. Yet once Israel had sworn an oath in the name of the Lord, they could not fix one failure by committing another. The Gibeonites were spared, but they became servants. Joshua reminds us that faithfulness includes seeking the Lord before we act and revering his name after we have spoken. From there, the rest of the conquest unfolds through the southern and northern campaigns. Joshua defeats the kings and cities the Lord gives into Israel's hand. These chapters can be difficult for modern readers, so we need to read them carefully and reverently. The conquest is not presented as random violence or human ambition dressed up in religious language. Long before Joshua, God told Abraham that his descendants would not receive the land immediately because, quote, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. God waited. He was patient. He did not rush to judgment. By the time Joshua enters the land, the conquest is presented as divine judgment after long patience, not cruelty without cause. The same book that shows judgment also shows mercy. Rahab and her household are spared. The Gibeonites are spared, though through a complicated episode. Joshua teaches us that the Lord is holy, patient, just, and merciful. He does not delight in evil, and he does not judge without righteousness. After the major campaigns, the book turns to the distribution of the land. These chapters may be easy to skim, but they matter deeply. The land allotments show promise becoming inheritance. What God promised to Abraham is now being mapped, named, bordered, and given tribe by tribe. Caleb appears in this section as a beautiful contrast to the fearful wilderness generation. He had followed the Lord wholeheartedly when others were afraid, and now, many years later, he still trusts God's promise. He is not coasting on old faithfulness. He is still ready to receive what God had promised. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh also show an important lesson. They had received their inheritance east of the Jordan, but they were still called to cross over and help their brothers until the Lord gave them rest. Their inheritance did not cancel their responsibility. Then, near the end of the book, Joshua gathers the people and calls them to covenant faithfulness. He reminds them what God has done. He warns them against idolatry. He calls them to cling to the Lord and serve him alone. Joshua does not end merely with land possessed. It ends with allegiance required. The question is not only, did God give the land? The question is, will God's people serve the Lord in the land he has given? Now that we have walked through the movement of the book, let's name several major themes to watch. The first major theme is the faithfulness of God. Joshua repeatedly shows that the Lord keeps his word. The promise given long before Joshua's generation is not forgotten. God brings his people into the land because he is faithful to what he has spoken. Every crossing, every victory, every allotment, and every moment of covenant renewal stands under that larger truth. The second major theme is courageous obedience. Joshua is told to be strong and courageous, but the book does not define courage as self-confidence. Courage comes from trusting the Lord's presence and obeying his word. The people move forward because God has spoken. They do not cross the Jordan because the river looks manageable. They do not march around Jericho because the strategy looks impressive. They obey because the Lord is with them and his word is enough. A third major theme is faith as covenant loyalty. Rahab turns toward the Lord and aligns herself with his people. Achan breaks faith by taking what belongs to God. The Gibeonite episode warns against acting without seeking the Lord. And Joshua chapter 24 calls the people to choose whom they will serve. So faith in Joshua is not bare belief. It is loyal trust expressed through obedience, worship, memory, and allegiance. Joshua also asks us to hold judgment and mercy together. The conquest is difficult, but Joshua does not present God as impulsive or indiscriminate. Genesis chapter 15, verse 16 helps us remember that God delayed judgment for generations. The Lord is patient, but he is also holy. And even in judgment, mercy is real. Rahab's rescue reminds us that the issue is not ethnicity, but response to the living God. Another major theme is inheritance. The land is not an abstract idea. It is given tribe by tribe, town by town, boundary by boundary. God's promise becomes visible. But inheritance also brings responsibility. The people must live faithfully in the land, help one another, remember the Lord, and refuse the idols of the nations. And finally, Joshua introduces the theme of rest. The Lord gives Israel rest from their enemies, but this rest is not final. The story will continue. Israel will still struggle. Judges will show how quickly covenant faithfulness can collapse. So Joshua gives real rest, but it points beyond itself to a greater rest still to come. A key verse for Joshua is Joshua chapter 21, verse 45. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. That verse captures the heart of Joshua. The book is not mainly about Israel's achievement. It is about God's faithfulness. Every battle, crossing, allotment, warning, and renewal must be read under this truth. The Lord keeps his promises. The people waited through generations of delay, slavery, wilderness wandering, and transition. But the promise did not weaken with time. God's word did not expire. What he promised, he brought to pass. That does not mean the story is complete. Joshua itself shows there is more land to possess and more faithfulness required. But Joshua chapter 21, verse 45 tells us how to read the book. God had spoken. God had acted. His good promises did not fail. So how does Joshua point us to King Jesus? Joshua points to Jesus through promise, inheritance, rest, judgment, mercy, and faithful leadership. Joshua leads Israel into the land God promised to Abraham's offspring. That inheritance is real, and we should not treat it as though it does not matter. God truly gives his people the land. He truly keeps his covenant word. But Joshua does not bring the final inheritance. He does not bring the final rest. He does not remove sin from the hearts of the people. He does not secure permanent covenant faithfulness in Israel. The book itself leaves us with warnings, choices, and the need to keep serving the Lord. That points us forward. Jesus is the greater Joshua, not merely because their names are connected, but because Jesus brings God's promises to their deeper fulfillment. Joshua leads Israel into a temporary land inheritance. Jesus brings his people into the lasting inheritance of God's kingdom. Joshua gives Israel rest in the land, but Jesus gives the greater rest that Joshua could not complete. Joshua calls Israel to serve the Lord in Canaan. Jesus reigns as king and calls people from every nation into faithful allegiance under his rule. Joshua also helps us see the mercy of God in a larger way. Rahab, a Canaanite woman in Jericho, turns toward the Lord and is brought into the people of God. That is not an interruption of the story. It is a glimpse of where the story is going. God's promise to Abraham was always larger than one family receiving land. Through Abraham's offspring, all the families of the earth would be blessed. That blessing comes fully through Jesus. He is the king who judges righteously, saves mercifully, keeps God's promises completely, and brings his people into the inheritance that will not fail. Now, how should we read Joshua well? First, read Joshua as a book about God's faithfulness before you read it as a book about Israel's courage. If we begin with human courage, we may turn Joshua into a motivational message. But if we begin with God's promise, God's presence, and God's power, then the courage of Joshua and Israel finds its proper place. They move forward because the Lord has spoken. They cross because the ark goes before them. They win because the Lord fights for them. They fail when they break faith. They renew covenant because the land is not theirs to possess apart from the God who gives it. Second, read Joshua as part of the larger Old Testament story. It belongs after Numbers and Deuteronomy, and it prepares us for Judges. Numbers showed unbelief that turned back. Deuteronomy renewed the covenant with the next generation. Joshua shows that generation moving forward in faith. Judges will show what happens when covenant memory fades and people begin doing what is right in their own eyes. Third, read the conquest with reverence and care. We should not soften God's judgment into something harmless, and we should not speak of it carelessly as though God delights in destruction. Joshua presents the Lord as holy, patient, just, and merciful. He judges evil after long patience, and he shows mercy to those who turn toward him. And fourth, pay attention to the land allotments. They may seem slow to us, but they are part of the message. God's promises are not vague. He gives real inheritance to real people in real places. The borders and towns remind us that God's word takes shape in history. So what do we carry with us from Joshua? First, Joshua teaches us that God keeps his promises on his own timetable. That may be one of the hardest lessons for us to receive. We often measure faithfulness by speed. If God delays, we wonder whether he has forgotten. If fulfillment takes longer than we expected, we begin to question whether the promise is still sure. Joshua tells us to look again. Abraham did not see the land possessed by his descendants. Isaac did not see it. Jacob did not see it. Joseph died in Egypt still trusting that God would bring his people back. Generations passed, but God's promise did not weaken. The same is true for us. We live between promise and fulfillment. Jesus has promised to return, and the passing of time has not made his word less certain. God's timeline is not ours, but his promises do not expire. Second, Joshua teaches us that faith moves forward because God has spoken. The new generation was not flawless, but they crossed the Jordan. They followed the ark. They obeyed at Jericho. They confronted sin at Ai. They received their inheritance. They renewed covenant allegiance. Faith does not mean we never stumble. It means we keep returning to the Lord, his word, his presence, and his claim over us. Third, Joshua reminds us that God's gifts bring responsibility. The tribes who had already received their inheritance still had to help their brothers. The land was a gift, but it was not permission selfishness. Receiving from God does not release us from serving others. And finally, Joshua presses us with the question of allegiance. The book ends with the people called to serve the Lord. That is the right ending because the land was never meant to replace the Lord. The gift was never meant to become greater than the giver. The people were not brought into the land so they could live as though they belonged to themselves. They were brought in so they could live as the covenant people of the Lord. If you would like the written companion overview, including the summary, major themes, key verse, and takeaways, you can find the Facebook post for this installment on the Tuesdays with Tony page. As we sit with Joshua today, maybe the question is not only whether we believe God can keep his promises, but whether we trust him enough to walk forward while we wait. God's promises may take longer than we expect, but they do not fail. And when he gives what he has promised, he calls us to receive his gifts with loyal faith, shared responsibility, and renewed allegiance to King Jesus. If you're willing, share your reflections or questions in the comments so we can learn and walk this journey together.